Some may find it difficult to imagine, but in fact, the Soviet Union was home to the first attempt at a Jewish-governed territory. How strange it was for the Kremlin to arrange for the creation of the Jewish National District in the desolate plains of eastern Siberia, bordering China, while simultaneously waging war against all religious practice in the Soviet Union. In the midst of the enforced atheism campaign in the former Soviet Union, and later competing with Israel as a destination for Jews, the National District, later upgraded to the Jewish Autonomous Region, was designed to fail. Jews have historically been oppressed in nearly every place which they have lived, not least of all in Tsarist Russia, an Orthodox Christian state. Anti-Semitic feelings dominated the landscape, with the Tsars themselves promoting Jewish emigration from Russia. Under Ivan the Terrible IV in 1563, 300 local Jews were drowned in the Dvina River because they refused conversion to the Orthodox faith. Popular Tsar Alexander II, famed for his benevolent 1861 abolition of serfdom in all of Russia, should also be noted for his oppressive treatment of minorities, particularly of Jews. Those Jews unfortunate enough to live under his rule experienced heavy restrictions on travel and were not permitted to own land. After Tsar Alexander II's 1881 assassination, anti-Jewish pogroms were carried out by some Christians in southern Russia who wrongly believed that Jews were responsible. His successor, Tsar Alexander III, promoted anti-Semitism to the masses of Russia, painting Jews as the murderers of Christ at every opportunity. He is remembered for scrawling that we must never forget that the Jews had crucified our Master and have shed his precious blood, in the margin of a memo he'd written. He was also responsible for the adoption of the May Laws, a set of regulations that he claimed would temporarily prohibit Jews from rural areas and introduce harsh quota limits on the acceptance of Jews into secondary and higher educational institutes. These laws remained in effect for 30 years, and they did not remain static. They became increasingly oppressive as time passed. By the time these laws were repealed in 1917, Jews could not participate in local elections. There were heavy restrictions placed on practicing Jewish doctors and lawyers. They were not permitted to sell alcohol, and vast numbers of Jews were barred from education. Additions to these laws frequently led to pogroms, quite possibly supported by the Tsarist secret police, ruining thousands of homes and lives of Russian Jews. It is no wonder that between 1881 and 1920, 2 million Jews fled Russia. Many of Russia's remaining Jews found themselves at the helm of the Russian Revolution of 1917. They had much to gain if the Tsarist Empire could be overthrown. Ethnically Jewish Russians occupied many leadership roles in both the Bolshevik Party and the Menshevik counterparty. Early in the socialist revolt, the Jews found their place easily. They were attracted to the socialist platform of Vladimir Lenin, himself a member of the Bolshevik Party, and later the first leader of the Soviet state. Lenin said that it is not the Jews who are the enemies of the working people. The enemies of the workers are the capitalists of all countries. Among the Jews there are working people, and they form the majority. They are our brothers, who like us are oppressed by capital. They are our comrades in the struggle for socialism. The Jews became such an integral part of the Bolshevik Revolution that its foes frequently and incorrectly painted Bolshevism as something that was specifically designed to cater to Jewish interests. In actuality, the original atheism and assimilation policies of the Soviet Union placed socialism distinctly at odds with the Russian Jewish population. When Stalin came into power as the leader of the Communist Party after Lenin's death in the 1920s, the dual Jewish problems of Zionism, the desire of Jews to have total political control over their own territory in Israel in order to return from exile and break the relentless cycle of persecution to which they had been victim to for as long as they could remember, and Judaism, the religion shared by many Jews, were raised for national scrutiny. Stalin's solution was the establishment of what was initially called the Jewish National District. The Jewish National District was created in 1928 as the official Soviet region for Jews to set roots down and further develop a culture in the socialist framework rather than the religious. The idea for the Soviet Zion, as it came to be nicknamed, did not have Jewish origins. In fact, the resolution for its establishment was completely drafted by top-level Soviet policymakers. The official language of the region was to be Yiddish, not Hebrew, as religious practices were forbidden, and Hebrew was, after all, the language of the major religious texts of Judaism. The location of the district itself was rather unsatisfactory for its purpose. There were already many well-established Jewish communities in the western portion of the USSR, but it was officially determined by the Kremlin that these locations were unsuitable for the district because they were surrounded by other nationalities and there simply wasn't any room for the anticipated expansion. However, it is likely that the selection was made as part of a concerted effort to populate eastern Russia in order to increase the productivity of the region and strengthen the Russian economy. Many Jews, enticed by a barrage of Soviet propaganda, left their homes in western Russia to make new lives in the town of Birobidzhan, the capital of the new Jewish National District. These Jews had read novels that, in Yiddish, described the Jewish utopia that was waiting for them. Strategically published newspaper editorials sang the praises of the land. Jews were offered free travel and government loans as part of an incentive to attract settlers to the region. These incentives appeared to be working at first, and the district was quickly upgraded to the status of autonomous region. Many Jews made the trip to build the Soviet Zion, but they were ill prepared for what they encountered on arrival. The terrain was harsh, swampy, and hardly suited for the farming the Jews were to do there. Some would even claim that the selection of this area for the project was made out of anti-Semitism on the behalf of Joseph Stalin. Nearly 5,000 miles away from Moscow, perhaps he wanted to keep the Jews as far away from the centers of Soviet power as he could. Authorities in the Jewish autonomous region were unready to receive the mass of poor Jewish immigrants who had arranged to settle in the area. A primary focus of the Soviet plan was to establish the Jews in agriculture. Over hundreds of years, the property rights of the Jews had been seriously eroded, to the point where an overwhelming majority of them could find employment only in service, commerce, and banking sectors. The presence of Jews in these industries increased the global distrust of them. Just 3% of the Jewish population made a living from farming the land they lived on, and from this fact came a movement to transform the Soviet Jewry from such occupations to agriculture, likely to make them more like peasants, easing assimilation into Russian society. The official position on the proposed conversion was that if the Jewish population could be productivized, they would play a stronger part in the building of a strong socialist economy and anti-Semitism would be squelched. However, the Kremlin likely distrusted Jews in traditional industries and wanted to move them elsewhere. The Jews that moved to the Jewish Autonomous Region had little to no farming experience. Most of the settlers had worked as blacksmiths, carpenters, woodworkers, and tailors in urban settings, and the land which was granted to them was unsurveyed and oftentimes uninhabitable. They were not prepared for the physical and emotional demands of pioneer life. They arrived to find undrained swamps waiting for them to till, with no drinking water. These pioneers were not provided with adequate housing, medical care, or food supplies by their government. Rations quickly ran out, and many of the settlers resorted to begging and prostitution to feed themselves and their families. The Jewish Autonomous Region was either poorly planned or planned to fail. On top of such bureaucratic dilemmas, the Autonomous Region was stricken by devastating floods between 1928 and 1932. Not surprisingly, many Jews gave up farming the rugged terrain and moved into the town of Birobidzhan to try their hands at occupations in which they had relevant experience. Many found employment in government offices, and even more found themselves back in the service sector, working in retail. Most, however, simply left the region to either go back to their homes in Western Russia or to live in the larger cities in the east, where they could return to their former occupations. In the 10 years after the Jewish National District was established, an incredible 35,000 to 40,000 Jews moved there. Nearly all of them left. Despite the obvious missteps of the Soviet bureaucrats in planning Birobidzhan, Yiddish culture made a mark on the region. A daily newspaper in Yiddish, Birobidzhaner Stern, was quickly founded, and streets in the capital were named after famous Yiddish authors. The capital was even home to a Yiddish theater troupe. But as Jewish historian Lucy DeWittowicz said, Yiddish was an insufficient basis on which to maintain one's identity. The language was certainly not as prestigious as the Russian tongue was, and in order for one to advance professionally in the rest of the USSR, one must have spoken Russian fluently. However far the Jews came in advancing Yiddish culture in the Jewish Autonomous Region, the project was decidedly ended altogether in the 1930s when Stalin began the first of his great purges. Once a formidable world superpower, the USSR was the country that decidedly stopped Hitler, ended World War II, and saved millions of Jews. However, before the war, Soviet hands certainly were unclean with regards to the treatment of their domestic Jews. Stalin's purges, in which those deemed counter-revolutionary were tried, often deported, imprisoned, or even sentenced to death and subsequently executed, affected a great many Jewish leaders, including some of the Jewish Autonomous Region. The regional government was hit particularly heavily with arrests and executions, targeting those who were politically involved with Jewish causes. It didn't take much to be considered a counter-revolutionary, and many other ethnicities apart from Jews were also deported, often in the most appalling conditions imaginable, with many people dying en route. During this time, all but 2 Yiddish schools closed their doors. But in 1945, at the end of World War II, the Jewish Autonomous Region experienced a surprising cultural revival. Many Jews found empty villages upon returning to their homes in Crimea after the Holocaust, having been evacuated by the Germans. The Zionist movement was stronger than ever, and many immigrated to the Jewish Autonomous Region for the Soviet alternative to settlement in Palestine. The Soviet government renewed incentives to stimulate immigration to the Far East, probably to increase the country's post-war productivity. 10,000 Jews moved to the Jewish Autonomous Region between 1946 and 1948, many of them skilled workers, such as engineers, technicians, and teachers. It's estimated that by the end of 1948, there were roughly 30,000 Jews living in the region, and many of them, in fact, held hopes that the region would even gain the status of an autonomous republic. Much national attention was given to the reportedly flourishing culture of Jewish art during this time. While it's true that many drawings and paintings were completed by Jews in Birobidzhan during this brief Renaissance, none of them contain themes that are particularly Jewish in nature. Titles of such works completed include The Brigadier in the Field, Meeting of Brigadiers, Socialist Town, and Portrait of a Young Tractor Driver. It would seem that the only distinctly Jewish aspect of these works was that the artists themselves were Jews. This was certainly not a failing on their part. Their output was subject to the same state scrutiny as were the works of any other Russian artists of the time. And though it was a time of temporarily relaxing Soviet cultural control, these artists were careful not to overstep the bounds of political acceptability. Interestingly enough, in this relatively relaxed time, Jewish Autonomous Region officials petitioned to and were approved by the Council for the Affairs of Religious Cults for permission to open a synagogue in Birobidzhan in 1946. The text of this petition indicates that the synagogue had actually existed prior to the war, but no other evidence exists to corroborate this. In all likelihood, the petition was referring to unofficial meetings and homes for religious practices. It would appear that the Kremlin was ineffective in stifling religious practices completely. The Birobidzhan revival was short-lived. Soviet officials had serious misgivings about the more open variety of Jewish expression than had previously been practiced. They became concerned that too many Jews were missing work to observe Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at the synagogue. Some of the Jews of Birobidzhan were communicating and exchanging ideas to a great extent with Americans, which, during the beginnings of the Cold War, led to a great distrust of such Jews, essentially as enemies of the state. Officials in the Jewish Autonomous Region had made the political mistake of accepting American aid packages, and for this the Kremlin was livid. Such an action could have fueled anti-Soviet sentiments in the West, as well as allow Americans to take credit for the success of the region. As the Cold War intensified, what were at one time Kremlin-sanctioned activities meant to promote the development of a Yiddish culture were now a liability. In 1948, Stalin began a more vigorous and brutal campaign of purges than the previous. Prominent Jews were frequently arrested for rootless cosmopolitanism and bourgeois nationalism.